So the poem called "The Garden of Proserpine" is a poem that speaks about the it's a poem about the underworld and death, and death as contrary to Christian concepts of the afterlife. It This poem rather emphasizes the restful nothingness uh, and eternal peace, like slumber of death, characterizing death as a kind of rest. And sometimes I was thinking, sometimes we need this kind of analogy for death, because life is often not easy on this plane, and when you are in a lifetime that is very challenging, or that in which you have much to do and you have much to um, balance within yourself uh, and others, there often comes a point where um, the best thing to have for a while, because nothing in this universe, I feel, is stagnant and unchanging. Um, Sometimes the best thing to have is a long period of rest, and almost like going into a sensory deprivation pod. Um, it's kind of like a reset, similar to how in indigenous cultures, oftentimes there's a rite of passage initiation, um, known as the vision quest, where there's fasting, and then there's an altered state one goes into, often grueling a little bit and not easy, which is why it's an initiation and rite of passage, right? But ultimately, through that initially or seemingly negative experience, finding the kind of light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, so that it's also, and I uh, kind of a thought onto the transformation of the caterpillar into a butterfly. You can even think of it as like a change in dimensions, where a rather flightless um, body becomes able to fly through the process, and it's almost like an enlightenment in a sense. So this kind of realization, so it's not, so even though it could, the poem itself could be interpreted as a kind of gothic, uh, dark, kind of what's the word? Uh, like nihilistic, kind of pessimistic view onto death. You rather we could think about it almost like Buddha's sense of nothingness, which is not actually nothing, but not a thing, which is not bound in a world of things. So in a sense, pointing to how it can become a window or opening into something, some kind of uh, um, heightened existence or perception and worldview and world that is not bound to the three-dimensional world of things, in a sense. So there's another analogy of the idea of Persephone, who is Proserpine, Persephone's garden, as a kind of transition and resilient uh, space for resilience and reclaiming of agency, both mythological and psychological, as a kind of road in through the underworld, that, like the sign of Scorpio, has has its dark aspect, but also has the lighter phoenix, transformational aspect of rebirth into the self, like the butterfly, but in this sense, from the underworld that is winter, rebirthing into the spring of the self, and the isolation of that space, lending to profound inner transformation, growth, and in so doing, finding the silver lining at the end of the huge rain cloud of tragedy, and a kind of reworking of lemons into lemonade, whereby we, through darkness, like the dark night of the soul, we find and make our own light shine brighter, is a kind of initiation. So the inner garden is as a kind of initiation and healing. And the last thing I want to mention is Dolores Cannon, who talks about the temples of healing that many people go to after they succumb, to a long bout of illness and or tragedy or some kind of tragic kind of death that requires a reboot and a kind of deep healing restoration. Oftentimes they go into this temple of healing in the if you ever read past life regression in the so-called afterlife. And the funny thing is, many people who are not dead yet, who still have their silver cord, so to speak, in the psychic sense, they also go to the temple of healing and are often seen by the people who are, regressed and talk about it. And the only difference is they still have the silver cord attached. So that's something to think about, hopeful in a sense, if you are open-minded enough to perceive that we live in a universe of energy that changes but does not wholly cease to be, as a kind of more hopeful but realistic, not realistic, that's not the word, more hopeful and maybe um, uh, like meaningful quest onto the question of the bigger questions that sometimes can be answered through our our big fields of science and Newtonian science and technology, without in the mainstream. So when I first found this poem, um, I initially didn't think too much into the more positive qualities of its meaning, and took it up front and only saw the negative, not negative, but the darker aspects, the underworld aspects of the Garden of Proserpine. But in talking about that, it gives a different dimension to the song or the poem or the song to be, and changes maybe the flavor of the rendering of music onto it. So, so I took a kind of more minor key, and the more drafter, more interrupted time I did it, and maybe this take would be a little bit less sad or mournful and more hopeful, or some kind of more whole feeling of what's that word? A kind of more balanced take on it. Neither too happy or too sad.